Our lesson today comes from Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth, and we're in the first chapter, beginning with verse 18. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks demand or desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. And I would suggest that it might be better for verse 25 to read, for the foolish thing of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weak thing of God is stronger than human strength, because in both cases we're talking about the cross. The cross may seem foolish, but it's wiser than human wisdom. And the cross may seem weak, but it's stronger than human strength. This is the word of God for the people of God. The good news of Jesus is, at one and the same time, quite easy to understand, or quite simple, you might say, and also a little challenging to get your mind around. Paul is addressing that in our lesson today. He's looking at it from one particular point of view, and that's what I want to stick with, but I just want to say in general, you can really dive into the gospel in a lot of areas to try to understand more and more and more of what's going on. But it's also quite simple. It just may not be simple from a human perspective. Paul lifts up that Jews are looking for signs, and the Greeks are looking for wisdom, but the cross flies in the face of both of those. Well, let's look briefly at what their meaning is so that we can understand what he's trying to say. Wisdom, at its most general level, is the ability to look out at the world around you, to observe the way the world works, and more or less figure out the way the world works, and then to align your way of living with what you've observed. So it's learning to live according to the knowledge that you've acquired by observation. That's wisdom. The signs that the Jewish people are looking for are not just the kind of signs you think of, like, the stars are aligned in a certain way, that kind of thing. We're talking about signs of power, signs of might. And that would make sense, because remember, the Jewish people are the continuation of a people who, the last time they were oppressed and under someone else's authority, they were in Egypt, and God sent Moses in, and God worked huge powers through that moment. Started by turning a staff into a serpent. Then he did things like send flies and insects and locusts and frogs to plague Egypt. And then he turned water to blood. And after a few more of those things, he sent the angel of death throughout Egypt. And the angel of death killed off the firstborn of all in Egypt, but passed over the people of Israel. When they finally were allowed to march out of captivity, and they found themselves between a rock and a hard place, God parted the waters of the Red Sea, and later in the desert brought forth water from a rock and brought quails in on the winds so that they'd have meat to eat, and then allowed that sort of sticky, honey-flavored, bread-like substance to show up on the ground. And it was so beyond their experience, all they could call it was, "What the heck is that?" Which is literally what manna means. Why wouldn't they then expect that when the promised Messiah, the promised deliverer, came among them, that he would come as one of power? After all, once again, they were languishing under the authority of a foreign power, the Romans, and they were, in a very real sense, oppressed. Why would they not expect that God would come with deeds of power? It is beyond logic that the Messiah, the promised one, would die on a cross. A cross, after all, is the Roman Empire's demonstration of its complete control. Basically, what they did was anybody who presented even the slightest hint of a threat to what we call the peace of Rome, that state of equilibrium where people were settled with the fact that the emperor was in charge, anything that would possibly threaten that resulted in someone being nailed up on a cross as a public display, not only to punish and kill the person who did it, but to let everybody else in the empire know this is what's going to happen to you if you mess with the status quo. By putting this Messiah person, this Jesus person up on a cross, what it said was, we're still the power in play here. We, the Romans, have it under control. It is an oxymoron. It's utter foolishness to imagine that the cross could mean anything else but loss, anything else but subjugation. And yet, we proclaim Christ crucified as a victory. If you look around at the way things work in the world, it's pretty easy to tell that if you want to impose your will on other people, the best way to do it is by force of violence. I shared with you before that the Assyrians were masters at it. They had elevated warfare to an art form, and siege warfare in particular, so that by the time their reputation was well established, they really only had to do one or two acts of horrible cruelty outside the wall of the city, and the entire city would just capitulate immediately. I'll spare you the details of the kind of thing they used to do, but suffice it to say, it was pretty scary stuff. And their enemy would just fold. Fast forward to the American Civil War. On different occasions throughout the war, one side or the other might have a numerical advantage. But pretty much what happened was, in any given battle, the one that had the strongest position and the best tactics for the occasion would exert its will over the opponent. So at Fredericksburg, for instance, for a variety of reasons, the Union General Burnside couldn't take the best route, and so he was forced to come right through the city across the river. Well, that meant it was a piece of cake for the Confederates to set up their defense. They took command of the high ground behind the city. They had this massive open field in front of them, probably 1,000 yards or so. They were able to set up a crossfire of cannons, plus line after line of trenches with people with rifles and muskets to pour lead down on that field. And you gotta think that either they were extremely brave or extremely insane, because wave after wave of Union forces tried to cross that battlefield, only to be slaughtered. Only to be slaughtered. It went back and forth like that throughout the war until finally the Union had one more victory than the Confederates could handle. But if the Confederates had won, we'd still have a Confederacy, because they would have used the power of military might to exert their influence, to impose their will. Instead, the Union got to do it, and now we have the continuation of the United States. But we see pretty clearly that not all is well even today. Because the reality is, when you impose your will through force, eventually those that are subjugated are going to start to rise up in rebellion. (1972). Just watched a movie about it yesterday. They called it Bloody Sunday. In Northern Ireland, there was a group of Irish folks who decided they were going to march, a peaceful protest for civil rights. But the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, had inflicted quite a few blows on the British Army. And so the British Army decided that they weren't going to take any chances. And quite honestly, they were itching to get some revenge. They sent in a pretty well-armed force to prevent the march from happening, but the march went on anyway. And sure enough, there were a couple of things that happened that led to the British military shooting into the crowd. And something on the order of 25 or 26 of them were shot. 15 or 16 of them were killed, unarmed. And no one ever was brought to justice for that. But the British were able to impose their will because of the force of power, the force of might. Fast forward a couple more decades, and it's the United States in the first Gulf War against Iraq. And probably the perfect picture of a bully against a tiny, defenseless person. There was no question what the outcome of that war was going to be. None. I don't claim to know all of Schwarzkopf's tactics, but I know a couple things. For instance, one of the things he did was he knew that Hussein's forces could not adequately cover the entire border with Kuwait. And so he sent his tanks en masse doing a left-end run, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. The tanks just rolled over everything that they had in defense. No question about the outcome. And we watched on the news, sometimes live, as smart bombs hit their targets precisely every time. But now there's still problems. Even within a few years, the exertion of our will, the enforcement of our will on that small piece of land began to see rebellion in the middle. Because to one who observes carefully, we know that any time we use force to impose our will on someone else, it never lasts. But the wisdom of the world says that's the way you go about it. What the Romans did to Jesus made perfect sense. It is an oxymoron. Literally, the word that is used there for foolishness is the word from which we get moron. It is moronic to think that God could have any kind of victory through a Messiah on the cross. And yet that is precisely what we proclaim as Christians. Christ crucified. But let's think about it from a slightly different angle. Let's consider that maybe we're not seeing things the way God sees things. You see, at its heart, the idea of being saved is that process that takes us from seeing things through worldly eyes to seeing things through God's eyes, and then aligning our lives with what God's ideals are. Living into God's vision of things. So with that in mind, Jesus, God incarnate, never says a mumbling word, the psalm said. Instead, he absorbed everything the Roman Empire could throw at him. The worst of the worst that the empire could throw. He absorbed it all. Right up to and including his own death. But even that, even the worst of the worst the world could throw at him was not enough, for he rose again. No power on earth could overcome God. But by doing what he did, instead of meeting force with force, by absorbing it all, what he did was to demonstrate that he loves so much, even the one who wants to destroy him, that he's willing to put them ahead of himself. Jesus dies and rises again only to love the very people that killed him. And if you follow the train of thought clearly enough, that means to love us, because we were as much to blame for his death as anybody else. God does not impose his will through force. God seeks to influence us by giving himself as a sacrifice for us. And so we learn from the cross who God really is. God is the one who is so concerned with the other that he was willing to die rather than retaliate. And we learn that if we're going to align our lives with God's way of seeing and doing things, then we too must put the other first. We too must be willing even to sacrifice ourselves for the well-being and the future of another. The cross, that that weak thing, that foolish thing of God, turns out to be far stronger than anything we ever imagined. Turns out to be far more sensible, far wiser than anything we could conceive in our human minds. He gives himself completely for us, and we are called to give ourselves completely for one another and for all out there in the world. May it be so.